His heart still beats. The commoner's cry echoed through the royal crypt, swallowed by shadows that seemed to breathe. The stone was cold beneath her palms as she knelt, fingers trembling against the marble sarcophagus. Outside, rain hammered the Gothic windows of the palace, an autumn storm that had lasted 3 days, as if the sky itself mourned what lay entombed below. Margaret had worked in these halls for 20 years as a chambermaid, invisible, forgettable, until the moment she heard it. That sound, that impossible rhythmic sound that no corpse should make. The body belonged to Prince Adrian, dead for only 6 hours. The official story spoke of a wasting illness, consumption they called it, though Margaret had seen him move through the palace corridors with an otherworldly grace that no sick man possessed. She had glimpsed him once on the grand staircase, his pale fingers trailing along the banister, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the living world. Those eyes. She would never forget their color, a gray so ancient it seemed to hold centuries. When the physicians declared him dead that morning, Margaret felt something shatter inside her chest. She didn't understand why. She was nothing to him. She was less than the dust on his boots. But she had heard his heart beating. Now, as the royal family gathered above in the great hall for the death rites, she remained below, alone with the casket and the truth that would condemn her if discovered. Her ear pressed against the stone, she heard it again, thump, thump, slow, deliberate, impossibly alive. Her own heart raced in response, a wild counterpoint to his measured pulse. "You shouldn't be here." Margaret's body went rigid. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, emerging from the shadows as if the darkness itself had learned to speak. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The sarcophagus lid began to move. It was not a sudden violent eruption, but a deliberate, almost gentle sliding. Stone against stone, the sound of centuries shifting. And then, impossibly, a hand emerged, pale, long-fingered, marked with a thin scar that ran from wrist to knuckle. The hand that had once signed decrees for the kingdom now gripped the edge of stone with a strength that should have belonged to a ghost. Adrian's face appeared next, water-slicked hair dark as obsidian, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. He moved with the fluidity of someone awakening from a long sleep, muscles remembering themselves, joints learning the language of motion once more. There was no confusion in his gaze, no disorientation, only recognition, as if he had been waiting for her specifically to witness this resurrection. "Please," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Your Highness, I didn't know. You heard my heart." It wasn't a question. He said it as one might observe that she had seen the rain fall, a simple fact of existence. His accent carried something old in it, something that predated the kingdom itself. "How many others?" "No one. I swear it. She couldn't complete the sentence. She only what? Came to the crypt at night because she couldn't bear the thought of him in darkness? Spoke to his tomb as if prayer might resurrect him? Loved a man who had never known her name?" Adrian stepped from the sarcophagus with the grace of a dancer, his burial shroud falling away to reveal clothes beneath, dark velvet, centuries out of fashion, bearing the weight of time itself. He moved toward her slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal, and Margaret found herself paralyzed between terror and something else, something that felt like recognition. "What is your name?" he asked. "Margaret." The word escaped her like a confession. "Margaret." He repeated it as though tasting it, learning it, embedding it into whatever remained of his humanity. "I have been asleep for 143 years, and the first voice I hear upon waking is yours. The first witness to my resurrection is a woman who risks execution for kneeling beside my tomb." He reached out, and his fingers, those impossible, graceful fingers, found the pulse point at her neck. There, where her own heart screamed its desperate rhythm, he paused, his eyes closed. When they opened again, they were no longer gray. They were black, absolute, hungry, bottomless. "You should have left me buried, Margaret," he whispered, "because now I know you're alive, and that knowledge will be my salvation or my damnation." Above them, the funeral mass continued. Below them, in the shadows and stone, everything had changed. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured water into the basin, the ceramic pitcher rattling against her teeth-like hands. In the hidden chamber beneath the chapel, a room that had belonged to monks centuries ago, Adrian sat motionless on a wooden stool, studying his own hands as though they belonged to a stranger. "You're afraid," he said, without turning to look at her. "I'm terrified," she corrected, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your Highness, the guards will search. They'll come looking for you. They'll find you here, and they'll burn me, behead me, drive a stake through this wretched heart?" A ghost of something like amusement crossed his features. "There is nothing they can do to me that hasn't already been done, Margaret. And there is nothing I want to do to you that wouldn't be worse than death." She set the basin before him and watched as he immersed his hands in the water. His skin was pallid, almost translucent, traced with a network of dark veins that seemed to pulse with a life all their own. The water turned faintly crimson. "How long have you known?" she asked. "What you are." "I was transformed on the night of my coronation," Adrian said, his gray eyes studying the water as though reading prophecy in its depths. 217 years ago. A woman came to the ball, more beautiful than anyone had a right to be. She wore a gown the color of fresh blood, and when she danced, the world seemed to stop turning. When she kissed me in the garden, I thought I was dying. Turns out I was only beginning. Margaret sat across from him, her apron twisted between her fingers. "Did you love her?" "I loved her as a man loves fire," Adrian said quietly, with desperate passion and a death wish. "She promised me eternity. She didn't mention that eternity tastes like ashes." He withdrew his hands from the water, and Margaret watched as the veins beneath his skin darkened, thickened. She fed on the kingdom for 7 years. When the people began to realize what walked among them, she vanished, left me to face the consequences of immortal hunger. "So you allowed them to think you were dying," Margaret said, understanding dawning. "You created a legend, the prince consumed by mysterious illness. You orchestrated your own death." "I orchestrated my own burial," he corrected. "Death, it seems, is not so easy to manage." He turned to face her fully, and the weight of his gaze was like standing beneath a stone archway as it crumbles. "Why do you help me? You know what I am. You know what sleeps in this chest." Margaret stood, and before courage could abandon her entirely, she reached out and placed her palm flat against his chest. Beneath her hand, his heart beat. Slow, measured, eternal. It was warm to the touch and impossibly alive. "Because your heart still beats," she said. "Because something in me recognizes that even immortals deserve witness. Even monsters deserve someone who doesn't look away." Adrian's breath hitched, a sound so human it broke something in her. "If you stay here much longer, if you continue to shelter me, they will suspect you. They will torture answers from your mouth. The mercy I have left demands that I protect you from that fate." "Then take me with you," Margaret said, the words emerging before thought could arrest them. "When you leave this place, take me into whatever darkness you inhabit. I'd rather live in shadow with someone real than waste away in daylight pretending to be alive." "You don't understand what you're asking," Adrian said, rising to his feet. He towered over her, and for a moment she saw what the court must have seen in him before the coffin, a terrible, transcendent beauty. "To be with me is to accept that every sunrise is a death of another day. Every meal will taste like ash. Every mirror will become a tomb." "Then we'll break the mirrors," Margaret whispered. "We'll learn to love the dark." For the first time since he awakened, Adrian smiled. It was a sad thing, a broken thing, but it transformed his face into something achingly human. He reached for her, his fingers threading through her hair with the delicacy of prayer, and he drew her close until her forehead rested against his. "Forgive me," he murmured against her skin. "Forgive me for what I'm about to choose." His fangs descended, and Margaret closed her eyes. Outside, the autumn rain continued its lament against stone, as somewhere in the palace above, the kingdom mourned a prince who was learning, in darkness, how to live. The first bite didn't kill her. Instead, it transformed every cell in her body into a chorus of contradictions, ecstasy and agony woven so tightly that she couldn't distinguish where one ended and the other began. Adrian drank slowly, reverently, as if each drop of her blood was a confession he'd been waiting 2 centuries to hear. When he finally pulled away, Margaret was still standing, still breathing, still herself. But something fundamental had shifted. She could hear the rain now with crystalline clarity, each drop singing as it struck stone. She could smell the must of the crypt, the copper scent of blood, the ancient green smell of moss growing in darkness. She could feel Adrian's heartbeat echoing through her own chest, their pulses synchronizing into a single, terrible rhythm. "You didn't drink enough to turn me," she realized, her voice strange to her own ears. Deeper, more resonant, as though emerging from a well of ancient stone. "No," Adrian agreed, and there was a brittleness to him now, a tension that hadn't existed before. "Because transformation requires me to drain you completely, then give you my blood in return. And if I do that, if I truly make you like me, there will be no going back. You would spend eternity tied to my sins, my hunger, my endless night. I cannot, I will not, condemn you to that without absolute certainty." Margaret touched her throat, feeling the marks of his fangs already fading. "But I'm not human anymore, am I?" "No," Adrian said softly. "You're something new, something between. You have the senses of the immortal, the hunger that never fully sleeps, but you still cast a shadow. You still burn in sunlight. You're caught in the threshold, Margaret, and I've put you there with no way forward except through me." A sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps, the measured tread of guards searching the chapel, calling out in voices that echoed through stone corridors. The search was beginning in earnest. Adrian moved with the efficiency of centuries, pulling Margaret toward a passage she hadn't known existed. The darkness embraced them like water, and she discovered that she could see now, not with her eyes exactly, but with something deeper, something that perceived the shapes of shadow and light as intimate geography. They moved through tunnels that predated the palace, their feet finding purchase on stone worn smooth by centuries of other refugees, other desperate lovers, other souls fleeing judgment. "Where are we going?" Margaret whispered. "Away from here, away from the kingdom that demands explanation for the inexplicable." Adrian's hand remained locked in hers, warm and solid and real. "There's a world beyond these walls, Margaret, vast and terrible and beautiful. I've hidden from it for longer than you've been alive. But for you, for us, I think I'm ready to stop hiding." They emerged hours later in a forest glade where moonlight fell like water, and Margaret saw Adrian clearly for the first time without the corruption of stone and shadow. He looked young, perhaps 30 no more, but his eyes held the exhaustion of centuries. There were scars on his shoulders that no blade had made, and she understood that they were the weight of years themselves, carved into flesh by the mere passage of time. "I want to show you something," Adrian said, leading her to a small pool of water so still it might have been glass. He drew her before it, and Margaret gasped. Her reflection was changed. Her skin held a luminescence it hadn't possessed before, and her eyes were ringed with gold like the eyes of a predator, beautiful and terrible. "This is what I've made you," Adrian said, his voice heavy with regret. Half immortal, half alive, neither fully damned nor fully saved. Margaret reached out and touched her reflection, watching the ripples disturb the mirror. But she didn't look away. She didn't shrink from what she'd become. Instead, she turned to Adrian and took his face in her hands, and when she leaned in to kiss him, she tasted blood and rain and something like redemption. "You've made me free," she said against his lips, "and I choose you. I choose this darkness. I choose the threshold between life and death, because at least here, with you, I'm choosing something true." When they came together on the moss, it wasn't the violent coupling of prey and predator. It was something older and more tender. Two souls learning the language of belonging after centuries of solitude. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. 3 months passed like a single held breath. Adrian and Margaret moved through the continent, Vienna, Prague, Budapest, never staying long enough to become known, never remaining stationary enough for the authorities to track them. Margaret discovered that the world was entirely different when you could walk through it at night without fear. The streets became hers, the darkness became home, and Adrian became the only language she needed to speak. But the hunger never slept. It began as a whisper, a constant awareness of the blood moving beneath skin, the rhythm of strangers' hearts as they passed on cobblestone streets. Margaret would find herself following an old woman to her apartment, listening to the pulse at her neck, tasting the possibilities. Adrian's hand would find hers, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't a monster. Not yet. Not if she chose otherwise. "We have to feed," Adrian said one night as they stood on a bridge in Prague, watching the Vltava flow beneath them like liquid darkness. "You can't survive on the crumbs of my restraint forever. The hunger will consume you, Margaret. It will burn away everything human in you until only the beast remains." "Then what do we do?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking slightly. The pull was getting stronger. She'd already nearly lost control twice, once with a street musician in Vienna, once with a child who'd reminded her of herself. "We hunt," Adrian said quietly, "but not innocence. There are predators in every city, Margaret, men and women who prey on the weak. We become the shadow that stalks them. We become justice with fangs." That night, they tracked a man through the winding streets of the old city, a creature who'd been marking his victims for weeks, taking photographs of women he intended to hurt. When Adrian and Margaret cornered him in an alley, the man's scream lasted only seconds before Adrian covered his mouth. It was Margaret who brought him down. It was Margaret whose fangs tore into his neck. It was Margaret who drank until his heart stopped. And it tasted like absolution. "Welcome to the threshold," Adrian whispered as she pulled away, her mouth stained with blood that no longer horrified her. "Welcome to the place where predator and protector become the same thing." Margaret fell to her knees and wept, not from horror, but from relief so profound it nearly broke her. The hunger diminished. The gnawing ache in her chest eased. For the first time since Adrian had bitten her, she felt something like peace. But that peace was short-lived. As they made their way out of Prague toward Austria, they discovered they were being followed. A woman in a crimson cloak. Her beauty so absolute, it seemed to distort the reality around her. When she finally confronted them in a forest clearing, Adrian's body went rigid with recognition. "Hello, darling," the woman said, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. "I've been searching for you for over a century, and you've finally found a reason to leave your tomb." It was the one who had created him, the vampire who had initiated Adrian into immortality and then abandoned him to face its consequences alone. Her name was Isabel, and she moved through the forest as though she owned not just the trees, but the very concept of ownership itself. She wore her age like armor. Centuries of existence had carved her into something more sculpture than woman. Every line a memory, every gesture a threat. "You've grown soft," Isabel said, circling them with the predatory grace of a shark. 200 years of isolation, and now you waste your time with a half-breed child who doesn't even understand what she is. "Stay away from her," Adrian commanded, and Margaret heard centuries of power resonating through his voice. But Isabel only laughed. "Oh, Adrian, still so human in your limitations. Still trying to protect when you should be consuming. That's why I left you, you know. You were always going to be weak. Always going to carry the burden of morality like it was a cross." She stopped mere inches from Adrian's face, and when she smiled, her fangs were like pearl daggers. "I made you immortal because I thought you might become something magnificent. Instead, you became a cautionary tale." Margaret felt Adrian's hand reach for hers, and she gripped it. She could see now what she hadn't understood before, that his restraint, his mercy, his refusal to fully claim his power had been deliberate. He had chosen to be less than he could be. "You're right about one thing," Adrian said quietly. "I was always weak. But that's because strength without mercy is just another name for cruelty. And I've had enough of that to last eternity." He turned to face Margaret fully, and his eyes had shifted, the gray replaced entirely by black so pure it seemed to contain all the darkness ever created. "I can give you a choice now. I can finish what I started 3 months ago. I can make you like me, truly, completely, eternally mine. Or I can let you go. I can end this now, and you can have a chance at a normal life. A life in daylight. A life where you age and change, and eventually, mercifully, die." Tears ran down Margaret's face. She could feel the decision warring inside her. The part of her that still remembered sunlight. The part of her that craved warmth and natural food and the simple gift of mortality. But there was another part of her, a part that had been born when Adrian's fangs had pierced her skin. A part that recognized the threshold as home. "I would rather have one night with you than a century of daylight without you," Margaret said. Behind them, Isabel made a sound of disgust. "How perfectly, nauseatingly romantic. Let me show you both what eternity actually means." She moved like liquid shadow, and Adrian shoved Margaret aside just as Isabel's claws raked across his chest. They were fighting now. A battle that existed in 3 dimensions, moving too fast for human eyes to track. Margaret could see every moment with her half-immortal sight, could see the scars opening on Adrian's body, could see the way he refused to press his advantage, despite being stronger, despite centuries more experience. He was still refusing to be fully himself. He was still holding back. Margaret made her choice. She threw herself forward and intercepted Isabel's next strike, feeling claws rake across her own shoulder. The pain was exquisite, transformative, and in that moment of perfect agony, she felt something breaking inside her. The human she'd been, the chambermaid, the innocent, the observer, dissolved like salt in water. What remained was something new entirely. Her scream transformed into something inhuman as the transformation seized her. Adrian tried to catch her, tried to stop it, but it was too late. Margaret felt her bones restructuring, felt her skin burning from the inside as his blood, mixed with hers through months of intimacy and small feedings, finally completed its work. She was becoming. She was transcending. She was becoming something that had never existed before. When the transformation settled, Margaret was standing on 2 legs still, but she was more than she'd been. Her vision expanded into spectrums of light Adrian's eyes couldn't perceive. Her skin hardened into something that resembled mother of pearl, iridescent and beautiful and completely inhuman. And when she looked at Isabel, all the predator she'd been holding back rose to the surface. "You taught him to fear himself," Margaret said, her voice now a chorus of harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere. You taught him that power without restraint was the only path to immortality. But you were wrong. She moved with the speed of pure hunger, and Isabel barely had time to react before Margaret's fangs found her throat. The ancient vampire screamed, a sound that had never been meant to die in a forest far from home. But Margaret was merciless. She drank the centuries themselves, tasted the memories of empires rising and falling, experienced 1,000 nights of predatory satisfaction. When it was over, Isabel was ash on the wind. Margaret turned to Adrian, and he took a step back. He was seeing what she'd become, and there was something like fear in his eyes. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "I'm sorry I had to become a monster to save us both." "You're not a monster," Adrian said, moving forward to take her face in his hands. "You're exactly what we both needed you to be. You're the threshold given form. You're mercy and power in perfect balance." He kissed her as the sun began to rise, and neither of them felt its burn. They stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, watching the dawn break across waters that had witnessed empires fall to dust. Margaret could feel the sun burning her skin, transforming it into something like amber glass, and she found that it no longer hurt. She had transcended pain the moment she'd drunk Isabel's essence. "What happens now?" she asked Adrian, who stood beside her shimmering in the morning light. His form was becoming translucent as the sun climbed higher, but he didn't look away from the horizon. "Now we choose," Adrian said quietly. Isabel was right about one thing. Immortality is a choice. Every night, every century, every eon we must choose to continue. And for the first time since my creation, I'm wondering if I want to. Margaret turned to him, shocked. "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 217 years I've been running from what I am, running from what I could be, running from the responsibility of immortal life. You stopped my running, Margaret. You made me feel something other than despair and hunger." He looked at her fully, and his ancient eyes were clear. "I want to stop running, but I don't know if I want to run toward immortality or toward an ending." "Then we choose together," Margaret said, taking his hand. Her grip was stronger now, capable of shattering stone without effort, but she held him gently. "We don't have to decide today. We don't have to decide for 100 years. We only have to decide right now, in this moment." "What do you want, Margaret?" Adrian asked. "Now that you understand what you are, now that you've tasted the weight of centuries through Isabel's blood, do you want forever?" Margaret considered it. She could feel the potential inside her now, the capacity to walk through time for eternity, to watch civilizations rise and fall, to accumulate knowledge and power until she became something divine. But she could also feel something else, a weariness that transcended exhaustion, a recognition that forever is not a gift but a burden, and that sometimes the most courageous choice is knowing when to say goodbye. "I want," Margaret said slowly, "to choose you until I don't. And when that day comes, I want to choose an ending that means something. I want to be remembered as someone who loved not for forever, but for as long as it mattered." Adrian pulled her close, and they stood together as the sun climbed higher, neither of them burning now, both of them transformed beyond the reach of conventional damage. Behind them, the cliff gave way to miles of empty air. "There's something you should know," Adrian said. "Something I learned from Isabel's memories when you drank her. The first human who ever drank a vampire's blood was a priestess in ancient Rome. She was supposed to become like us, but she chose differently. She let the transformation finish, but then she walked into a church and asked God for mercy. And she got it. She aged. She lived for another 70 years, growing older each day, the immortal blood in her system slowly burning out. She became human again, and she died like a mortal should." "You're saying I have another choice," Margaret realized. "I'm saying that being on the threshold means you have options we don't. You could choose to remain like this forever, caught between light and dark, neither fully mortal nor fully immortal. Or you could choose to become fully like me. Or... He paused, his expression aching with hope and fear in equal measure. You could choose to be human again. It would take time. It would be painful. But you could grow old again, Margaret. You could die. Margaret was quiet for a long time, listening to the waves crash against stone far below, feeling the sun warm her amber skin, sensing Adrian's heartbeat next to hers. And she understood finally what the real mercy was. Not the vampire's immortal love, not the eternal promise of forever together, but the gift of choice, the knowledge that she didn't have to sacrifice herself to the darkness to earn his love. I want to stay like this, Margaret finally said. Not immortal, not quite mortal. I want to stay in the threshold with you, caught between life and death, never fully belonging to either world. I want us to walk this narrow path together for as long as it endures. And when the time comes, when one of us falls or fails, I want to face it without fear. Adrian drew her toward the cliff's edge, and together they looked out at the vast expanse of sea and sky. Somewhere out there, the world was continuing without them, growing and changing and dying as it always had. But here, in this moment, they had found something most people never experience: absolute understanding, complete acceptance. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Years passed, like pages turning in a book no one was reading. Adrian and Margaret carved out a life in the spaces between mortality and eternity. Cities that welcomed their strangeness, communities where their dual nature went unquestioned. They became ghosts in the margins of civilization, never fully present in any one place, never fully absent from anywhere. In Vienna, they lived in a house with walls painted the color of old blood. In Constantinople, Istanbul now, they walked the streets under moonlight that seemed to pour from their own skin. In London, they attended theaters and concerts, watching mortals move through their brief, luminous lives with a tenderness that bordered on worship. Margaret discovered that she had gifts beyond mere strength. She could sense lie and truth with equal precision. She could touch a person's skin and feel the architecture of their choices laid bare. She became something like a confessor for those who found her in dark corners. Humans sharing their burdens with someone who existed outside their rules, who could understand the weight of being caught between desire and duty. Adrian, for his part, began to heal in ways he hadn't thought possible. Margaret's presence reminded him that immortality didn't have to be predatory, that time could be a companion instead of a torturer, that each year didn't have to be a repetition of the last, but rather a chance to discover something new about existence itself. But the hunger never truly left. It was merely transformed, channeled into something less destructive. They still hunted, but they hunted carefully, deliberately, choosing their prey from among those who preyed on the innocent. They became legends in certain circles, urban myths shared in whispers. The lovers in the dark who punished predators and vanished like smoke. One night in Barcelona, as they walked along the Gothic Quarter's ancient streets, they encountered a young woman barely 20, addicted to blood in the same way Margaret had once been addicted to breathing. She was newly turned, abandoned by her creator, standing at the threshold themselves. Adrian wanted to turn away. They had learned long ago that saving others rarely ended well. But Margaret stopped him. "We can't leave her," Margaret said, taking the girl's trembling hand. "We, of all people, know what it means to be abandoned on the threshold." And so they became three, teacher and student, and something more complex, a triad of creatures learning together that immortal life didn't have to be lonely. The girl, who called herself River, brought them both back to the fundamentals of what they were. She reminded Adrian of his own awakening. She reminded Margaret of the human she'd been. River's presence changed them both in subtle but profound ways. Adrian began to understand that his loneliness hadn't been inevitable, but chosen. Margaret began to recognize that mercy wasn't weakness, but its own form of strength. And River discovered that being caught on the threshold wasn't a curse, but a gift. The ability to see both sides of human existence, to inhabit both light and dark without being consumed by either. The three of them became inseparable, and the dynamic shifted something fundamental. Adrian and Margaret weren't just lovers anymore. They were architects of a new kind of immortality, one based not on dominance or predation, but on choice and community, and the radical act of choosing redemption even when damnation was easier. Years became decades, decades became centuries, and Margaret watched with wonder as Adrian's expression slowly transformed. The weight that had lived in his eyes for 200 years began to lighten. The terror that had driven him for so long began to ease. She'd given him something more precious than immortality. She'd given him permission to stop running. On the night of their 274th year together, Adrian took Margaret to a place she'd never been. It was a monastery, ancient and remote, built into the side of a mountain in what had once been called Persia. The structure seemed to grow from the stone itself, Gothic arches merging seamlessly with Persian domes, centuries of architecture layered upon each other like sediment in a river. Stone walls, weathered by millennia, held windows that glowed with candlelight so warm it seemed to pulse like a living heartbeat. Inside there were others like them, creatures who existed on thresholds, who had chosen mercy over malice, who had learned to love eternity instead of endure it. Margaret counted them as they emerged from the shadows. A woman whose eyes held the weight of ancient Rome, a man whose hands bore the scars of a crusader, a child who had been turned during the Black Death and had chosen to remain a child forever, refusing to grow beyond the moment of her transformation. There were at least 50 of them, perhaps more, beings whose existence defied category, who had found sanctuary in this place built at the edge of the world. "I didn't know there were so many," Margaret whispered, watching as beings of impossible ages moved through candlelit halls with the grace of prayer. Some wore clothes from centuries past, preserved like relics. Others dressed in contemporary garments, blending into the modern world whenever they ventured out. All of them moved with a kind of choreographed awareness, as though they'd been rehearsing this moment for decades. "There aren't many," Adrian corrected gently, his fingers intertwining with hers. "But those who exist, who choose differently than the others, eventually they find this place, or we find them. We gather at the turning of centuries to remember what we've learned and who we've chosen to become. It's a rite older than any religion, older than any empire, a gathering of the redeemed." They were led through corridors lined with tapestries that depicted scenes Margaret didn't recognize, not from any history book, but from something deeper and more intimate. A vampire saving a drowning child, a creature of the night standing vigil over a plague victim, an immortal kneeling before the altar, hands pressed together in prayer. These were the stories the monastery kept, the evidence that not all monsters chose damnation. That night, they stood at the center of a vast chamber deep beneath the monastery. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow, and the walls were covered entirely in mirrors, thousands of them, each reflecting candlelight in infinite recursion. At the center of the chamber stood an altar made of white marble, and around it, in a perfect circle, the ancient ones assembled themselves. They moved like water finding its level, each creature positioning themselves according to some hierarchy Margaret couldn't quite perceive. Adrian stepped forward, and Margaret felt the weight of centuries focus on him. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from the stone itself, resonating through bone and blood and the spaces between heartbeats. 274 years ago, Adrian began, his words echoing through the chamber as though the monastery itself was translating them into every language ever spoken. I woke in darkness. I woke to hunger that felt like it could devour the world. I woke to find myself transformed into something that should not exist, something that violated every law of nature and God and human understanding. I expected to spend eternity as a predator, as a monster, as the kind of creature that mothers warn their children about in whispered tales. He paused, and in that moment, Margaret could see him, not as he was now, but as he had been. She could see the prince in coronation robes, beautiful and doomed. She could see the corpse in the sarcophagus. She could see the awakening, the confusion, the terrible hunger that must have threatened to consume him entirely. But then I found a reason to stop running, Adrian continued, and his eyes found Margaret's across the chamber. I found someone who saw me, not as a monster, not as a prince, but as a being caught between eternal damnation and eternal grace. That person was brave enough to kneel beside my tomb, brave enough to help me escape, brave enough to risk her own humanity to save my immortal soul. Margaret's breath caught as Adrian moved toward her, and the circle of ancient ones parted to create a corridor of shadows and candlelight. She could see River standing at the far edge of the circle, her young face bearing an expression of absolute understanding. River had lived only decades, but she had chosen this path independently, chosen to save others even when it meant risking her own transformation. That person taught me that the real immortality isn't in the endless years, but in the moments we choose to cherish them, Adrian said, taking Margaret's hands. His palms were warm, and she could feel his heartbeat through his fingers, that same impossible pulse that had drawn her to the crypt all those centuries ago. It's not in the blood we drink, but in the love we share. It's not in the nights we survive, but in the connections we build. It's not in the power we wield, but in the mercy we extend. Around them, candles burned so bright they cast no shadows. The mirrors on the walls reflected infinite copies of this moment, multiplying it across impossible distances. Margaret could see herself reflected infinitely, thousands of versions of herself, all of them standing at this threshold, all of them choosing again and again to love, to stay, to commit. I've spent centuries trying to understand what mercy means, Adrian continued, his voice dropping to something more intimate, something that seemed to reach directly into Margaret's chest and touch the place where her heart, still beating, still somehow vital despite everything, continued its endless rhythm. But I realize now that mercy isn't something we offer others. It's something we offer ourselves. It's the choice to forgive the past, to accept the present, to step into the future without carrying the weight of everything we've suffered. He released one of her hands and gestured toward the circle of immortals around them. Each of these beings has chosen mercy. Each of them has stood at the threshold between damnation and grace, and chosen differently than their creator intended. The vampire who sleeps in sunlight to atone for centuries of predation. The immortal who feeds only on animals, refusing ever again to taste human blood. The creature who has spent 300 years teaching music to children, pouring beauty into the world to balance the darkness inside herself. Adrian turned to face Margaret directly, his body blocking out the candlelight so that she saw him silhouetted, outlined in gold. His ancient eyes, those gray eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, were clear in a way she'd never quite seen them before. There was no fear in them, no shadow, no weight. "Margaret," he said, and the way he spoke her name transformed it into a prayer. "I have one final question for you, the question I should have asked when I first woke in that tomb. The question I've been too afraid to ask because I didn't believe I deserved the answer. Are you ready to stop being on the threshold and start being fully, completely, eternally mine?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the candles seemed to stop flickering. The mirrors froze mid-reflection. The world held its breath. Margaret's hands trembled. She could feel every version of herself reflected in those thousands of mirrors, and they were all asking the same question. How could you choose forever with someone like him? How could you commit to eternity when time itself was uncertain? How could you accept being bound to the night forever? But as she looked into Adrian's eyes, she saw something that transcended all those fears. She saw a being who had chosen redemption. She saw a creature who had spent centuries learning to love instead of hunger. She saw someone who had waited for her, waited through the centuries, through wars and plagues and the rise and fall of civilizations, because he believed that mercy could resurrect even the damned. "I want to ask you first," Margaret said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, which echoed through the chamber with its own kind of power. "Are you ready to stop running? Are you ready to commit, not just to me, but to the forever we've been avoiding? Are you ready to accept that choosing eternity doesn't mean choosing to be alone in it?" Adrian's face transformed. For a moment, she saw something like fear cross his features, the terrible fear that comes with truly committing to something, with surrendering the last remaining walls of self-protection. But then it passed, and what remained was tenderness so profound it seemed to crack open the very foundations of the monastery. "I've been ready since the night you placed your hand on my chest and felt my heart still beating," Adrian said, dropping to his knees before her. This ancient creature, this prince of eternal night, this being who had witnessed empires fall to dust, this being kneeled. "I've been ready since the moment I realized that mercy wasn't weakness, but the bravest choice a creature like me could make. I've been ready since you looked at me with no judgment, only recognition, only love." He took both her hands in his, and Margaret felt the weight of centuries compressed into that single gesture. 274 years of longing, of searching, of slowly learning to exist in a world that should never have contained him. "I choose you," Adrian said, his voice breaking slightly over the words. "Not for forever measured in years, but for forever measured in the depth of how I hold you. For forever measured in the number of times I choose to look at you and remember that I was once allowed to be something other than a monster. For forever measured in the quiet moments when you sleep beside me and I don't have to pretend anymore. For forever measured in every night we choose, again and again, to keep loving instead of giving in to the hunger." Around them, the monastery erupted in a sound that wasn't quite applause, but something more profound, a resonance that seemed to come from the stones themselves, as if ancient walls were bearing witness to a moment of transcendence. The sound was like wind through canyons, like the ocean discovering land, like the universe itself recognizing that something had shifted in the fundamental architecture of existence. Margaret pulled Adrian to his feet and kissed him as the candles around them burned bright enough to cast no shadows. She tasted centuries on his lips, not just the years they'd spent together, but the centuries before, the loneliness that had nearly consumed him, the hunger that he'd channeled into something close to art. She tasted redemption, salvation, the possibility that even creatures like them could be forgiven. And in that moment, suspended between the mortal world and the immortal, between the known and the infinite, she felt something like certainty crystallize inside her chest. This was what eternity meant. Not endless time, but this, the choice to hold someone close and say yes, again and again, to the future you were building together. River joined them at the altar, her young form seeming almost impossibly fragile compared to the weight of centuries that Adrian and Margaret carried. She took their hands and wove her fingers between theirs, creating a trinity, three beings caught on the threshold, learning together what it meant to transcend without being consumed. "We are the redeemed," River whispered, and her voice carried a power that belied her apparent youth. "We are the proof that mercy exists. We are the evidence that monsters can choose differently." The ancient ones stepped forward one by one, and each of them touched the intertwined hands of Margaret, Adrian, and River. As they did, Margaret felt something pass between them. Not blood exactly, but something like shared memory, shared pain, shared triumph. She felt the cumulative weight of their choices. She felt the long centuries of restraint, of choosing to feed only on those who preyed on the innocent, of building community instead of empire. A woman with eyes that held Rome whispered ancient Latin. A man bearing crusader scars traced a cross in the air above them. The child who had been turned during the plague began to sing, a lullaby in a language Margaret didn't recognize, but understood perfectly, wordless and true. Outside the monastery, the mountains held their silence. Beyond the walls, the world continued its rotation, oblivious to what was happening in this sacred space. But inside, something fundamental was shifting. 3 creatures, neither fully human nor fully monster, caught forever on the threshold between damnation and grace, had made a choice that transcended time itself. As the ceremony continued through the night, Margaret felt the last vestiges of fear dissolve from her being. She understood now what Adrian had understood centuries ago, that immortality wasn't a curse, but a gift, if you chose to treat it as one. That the hunger could be channeled into something redemptive. That love, real, committed, chosen again and again through eternity, was the only immortality that would ever truly matter. Adrian held her close as the candles burned lower, and she could feel his heartbeat synchronizing with hers, 2 pulses becoming one rhythm. River sang softly, that old prayer in a language that predated human speech, and the stones of the ancient monastery listened and remembered. In the distance, a wolf howled at the moon, and the sound was answered by another and another, until it seemed the entire mountain was singing. The wolves weren't howling in hunger or in pain, but in recognition, in witness, in the profound understanding that something sacred was occurring beneath the stone and shadow. The hunger would never fully leave them. The pull of blood would haunt their nights. The weight of eternity would press down upon their shoulders in the darkest hours before dawn. But it would no longer define them, because they had discovered something that immortals rarely find: purpose, community, a reason to continue beyond mere survival. They had found a way to make the threshold into home. When the ceremony finally ended as dawn approached and the mirrors began to reflect the first light of morning, Adrian, Margaret, and River stood at the center of the altar. The ancient ones had withdrawn, returning to the shadows of the monastery to sleep through the day. But their presence remained, a benediction, a blessing, a promise that they were no longer alone. Adrian pulled Margaret toward a window of ancient glass that looked out over the mountains. In the distance, the sun was rising, that terrible, beautiful enemy of creatures like them. But Margaret realized that she was no longer afraid of it. Adrian's hand was warm in hers, and River was humming softly nearby, and the threshold they inhabited together felt less like a prison and more like a kingdom. "I love you," Margaret said, the words simple and profound and absolutely true. "I love you," Adrian replied, "more than I love immortality, more than I love darkness, more than I love the night. I love you more than I love forever." "Then we're exactly where we need to be," Margaret said, watching as the sunlight began to turn their skin to something like amber glass, something like precious stone, something like the substance of eternity itself. The threshold had become eternal, not because they had stopped choosing, but because every single night, every single moment, they chose again, to love, to endure, to forgive, to remain bound to each other in the spaces between light and dark. And that choice, repeated infinite times across infinite nights, stretched before them like a road without end, beautiful precisely because it was infinite, sacred precisely because it was chosen. Together they would walk it, not as monsters, not as victims, but as beings who had learned that redemption is not a destination, but a practice. That mercy is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. That the most eternal thing in the universe is not time itself, but the moment when 2 souls choose, again and again, to keep loving. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned.